passion and wonder and excitement. If you get to know Miss Kittle, you'll soon discover she lives by those beliefs. The author's college life involved a double major in English and education, a minor in theater, a job in the theater costume shop, and a position on the university's equestrian team. Katrina put her degrees to good use, teaching AP British Literature and theater at several Ohio schools. Later, she moved on to freelance work, including jobs as a veterinarian assistant, providing case management support at an AIDS foundation, cleaning houses, directing children's theater, and teaching writing to students as young as 3rd grade and as old as 80. Besides writing, she also enjoys gardening, cooking, and Latin dancing. And since the author believes in passion and wonder, it's no surprise to learn she loves to travel. You'll have to ask her about some of her unusual travel experiences. The author's books, which include Traveling Life, Two Truths and a Lie, The Kindness of Strangers, and The Blessings of the Animals, have won a variety of honors and awards. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you will be happy to join me in welcoming Katrina Kittle to this, the 2011 spring session of the Medina County District Library's Writers Live.
Thank you, Holly, for that wonderful intro. And thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, especially as Christina referenced. I don't know if several of you I know come every year, and in 2007 I was scheduled to be here. I was in a very bad horse riding accident. Everything's fine, but I had a concussion, I broke my nose, I had to have oral surgery on some broken teeth, and I looked like Frankenstein and could barely speak, much less make the drive. So I had to, it was the first event ever in my life as an author that I had ever had to cancel, and I felt horrible. So it's really wonderful to have the chance to be here today. And I have to tell you, the weather's been so crazy, but Monday, at least down in Dayton, was very, very beautiful. And a friend called me and wanted me to go on a trail ride. And I looked at the calendar and said, maybe not. Ask me after Thursday. Because I was like, I cannot take the chance of not making it here again. So I'm very pleased to be here. What I thought I would talk about is kind of my evolution as a writer, kind of the journey that I was on, and the evolution of the books, and bring us up to the most recent book, tell a little bit about the books that are to come, and then there's time for question and answers, which is always my very, very favorite part of any presentation. As Holly mentioned, I do love quotes, and I got nervous there for a second, like she's gonna use the one I'm starting with, but she didn't. My writing office is full of quotes. I have quotes written painted on my kitchen walls. I'm just kind of crazy about them, and you can see that come out in the novel Traveling Life. But the first quote that I kind of want to shape this talk today with is one of my very favorites, and it says, "Leap and the net will appear." Leap and the net will appear. I love that. And that is actually how I became a writer, and really how I came to be a published author who's here with you today. Traveling Light was my very, very first novel, and I didn't know really what I was doing, but I knew I needed to write it. And by simply leaping, I started in the most important place that any writer can, which is having a topic that you are very, very passionate about, and then simply writing. And with that novel, the topic was AIDS. I really wanted to put a human face on AIDS for the students that I was teaching at the time. And part of that came from losing so many friends, including a very important mentor that I'll tell you about to that disease. And I was teaching English and theater, as Holly said, at Centerville High School in Dayton. And my students were very, very good people, but they were a little ignorant about AIDS, and some of the things that they said in their ignorance really chilled my blood. This was in the early 90s, though, and most people were very ignorant of AIDS then. So why did I want to write about AIDS? This is where I'm going to back up and give a little bit of biographical information, which is exactly how you would never, ever want to do it in a novel. You would never want to stop and say, wait, here's some exposition. But I think it's important to back up and tell you that I did not set out to be a writer. I came to writing fairly late. I never thought about writing for publication until after I graduated from undergrad. So another quote that I love comes from Julia Cameron. I don't know if many of you are familiar with The Artist's Way and her other books, amazing books that changed my life. But one of her quotes is, In order to make art, we must first make an artful life, a life rich enough and diverse enough to give us fuel. So even though I came to writing later, I feel like my early path was actually really, really great training and a perfect path to kind of shape me as a writer. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a classical ballerina. And I studied very, very seriously. I was very committed to it. And I was good. I was not as good as Summer is in Traveling Light, but that's the beauty of fiction. You get to change things like that and make it how you want. I was good, but I did not have the classic body profile that's necessary for classical ballet. No matter how skinny you make yourself, you're kind of stuck with your essential skeleton, and I'm just too tall. I was already taller than all of the men in my classes, and point shoes add 3 inches to your height, so this was not going to be my path. But, like I said, I was good enough, and it took a while for us to realize that this was not going to be the path. And I actually danced with the second company of the Dayton Ballet for some time, and Stuart Sebastian was the artistic director during my time there. And he was a really, really crucial mentor to me in many ways beyond dance. He was the artistic director, but he also taught the partnering class and several of the point classes. And he was the first person that I ever knew who had AIDS. I was a sophomore in high school. This was before they were even calling it AIDS. They still called it GRID. I don't know if you guys remember gay-related immune deficiency. So we didn't even have the name AIDS yet. And so this is early in the 80s, and it was really hard for me that young to kind of reconcile this horrible, obscene death of this very gracious, generous, loving person with the media coverage, when you could find media coverage, that was very, very judgmental and harsh. So even though I had no idea that I would ever write about AIDS, even at that age where most of my classmates knew nothing about this and weren't thinking about it at all, it had touched my life much earlier than my peers, and I kind of stored it away. Like I wasn't done reconciling this or dealing with it in any way. So writers use everything, but sometimes a story will simmer for a long time, like up to a decade. Stuart was actually key to my understanding that I was not going to be a dancer. And he helped me make that transition in a really lovely way that was all about the possibilities instead of it feeling like a failure. So I feel eternally grateful to him. And so essentially, when I initially went off to college, I was a theater major. And you have to think about my poor parents. You know, it's like I go from dance to theater and then into English and all these practical pursuits, right? But I love my parents forever because with both my sister and I, they were very much about, you need to do what feeds your soul. You're smart girls, you will always be able to feed yourselves, you will always be able to get a job to feed your bodies, but it's really important to live a life where you're feeding your soul, where you feel alive. And so they did encourage us to follow our passions, even though those passions weren't very practical, and I think they took a lot of flack from relatives for, now she's doing what? And over and over again, every time I changed, it seemed less practical than the choice before. But, so after being in the dance world, I go off to college, and Holly told you a little about the college experience, and when I left college, I was teaching high school. And by the time, after being in the dance world and in the live theater world, by the time I graduated, you know, those communities, the dance and theater world, were hit hard and hit early by AIDS. And by the time I graduated, I kind of felt like I had buried half my address book. And so this was, you know, something that had really touched my life. And as I said, as these students, who were very good people, but just didn't have the understanding of it, I really found myself wanting to tell a story that would put a human face on this disease for people like them. And so I found myself with this story kind of eating at me, demanding to be told. And that goes back to the leap in the net will appear. I did the best thing I could, which is I just started writing. I had no idea what I was doing, but I did the most important thing a writer can do. And that starts a kind of pattern with me. All of my books, all 4 novels, have begun with a social issue that I care very deeply about. With Two Truths and a Lie, that topic is addiction and alcoholism. Kindness of Strangers deals with a case of child sexual abuse. Blessings of the Animals looks at marriage, gay marriage, and divorce. Now, if you haven't read any of my stuff, I want to say just a little note here that I am not a depressing downer like some of those topics might make you think. I feel really strongly, this is very important to me, that the books are all uplifting and hopeful. They may deal with some dark subjects, but I feel like you have to give the reader redemption. Otherwise, what's the point of going to the dark places, right? There has to be something that we gain from it. And so it's very important to me that the books always have some kind of redemption and mercy and end up very uplifting. So don't be afraid of some of these topics. So this leads me to another quote. This is an Ernest Hemingway one that I absolutely adore. "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are strong at the broken places." I love that quote. Human resilience really fascinates me. This is why I think I'm kind of drawn to those darker topics. The ways that people have been broken. And remember, the quote says, "The world breaks everyone," right? We all know it's true. You don't get the good stuff all the time. Sooner or later, life kicks all of us in the teeth at some point or another. But the ways that we've been broken and then have healed and become stronger at those broken places and gained new strength, that's the story that I'm obsessed with. And that's the story I'm interested in telling, and really I think that's the theme that all 4 of my novels share. And they're all variations on that theme. So I start with a topic that I'm really passionate about, but then because it's fiction, I have to find the story. It can't just be, a lecture on, I'm having trouble doing this one-handed, sorry. I think I'll be all right. Here, I can stick some here. Well, maybe not. Hang on just a sec. That works. Because, especially with fiction, you don't want to just lecture. If I just wanted to lecture and go around and tell people, here's what you should think about AIDS, or here's what you should think about addiction, I should be on a lecture circuit or write nonfiction. But it has to be a story. You have to find the people who will populate the story, and the story has to be more important than anything else. It can't just be a message. The idea is not to tell the reader what to think about a topic, but just to invite them to think about the topic, perhaps a topic that they've never entertained, and given any time to before. So, back to Leap in the Net will appear. I just started writing. I wanted to write this AIDS story. And so I started tackling a first draft. And I come to find out way later that this is the hardest thing for most writers. And in my ignorance, I did the most important thing I could do, and that is, I can't stress this enough. I know I've already repeated it several times. I just wrote it. I wrote the draft. Because here's the thing that all writers need to learn, anyone who's thinking about attempting this, is you can always make it better, but first you have to make it exist. And until you have the words on the page, you have nothing. But as soon as you have words on the page, no matter how bad and flawed they are, you have a story that you can shape and polish and begin to make better. So I wrote a draft of a novel, knowing nothing. And so I did the most important thing I could. I also took every creative writing class I could find in the area. I read every book on the craft of writing I could find, and there are a bazillion and one of them, as all of these wonderful library workers can tell you. But at the same time, I just wrote. Now, my first drafts are always way too long, and they're very indulgent and very preachy. My editor now has this thing where she'll just put in my margins of drafts that she reads, SB, and that stands for soapbox. She's like, you're doing it again. So my first drafts are very, very preachy, and then you try to take all of that out to where, again, it's the invitation for the reader to think instead of me telling you what you should think. And again, that's why I always encourage anyone who's interested in writing to, you have to write. The writing will teach you more than anything else. Traveling Light, my first novel, had 11 major overhauls. And I don't mean just going in and cleaning up the language and cutting adverbs. I mean, serious overhauls in who told the story. Originally, it was in third person from kind of limited to the brother, Todd, the person with AIDS. I changed that because as I started doing trying to read everything I could get my hands on that was already out there about AIDS, I realized that almost everything was being told from a gay male perspective. So what I could offer was not that story. That wasn't my story to tell, and it had already been done beautifully. So I could offer a different perspective on an AIDS story. It was kind of in a third-person omniscient for a while, and then I had this crazy idea that I thought was brilliant. After I saw the whole AIDS quilt laid out one of the last times in DC, I think it may have been the second to last time, I thought, okay, every chapter is going to be like a quilt block in first person, like a monologue from someone who knew Todd. Well, when I'm lucky enough to get reviewed, several of the things one of the things I get praised for is dialogue, and I think that comes from the theater background. Well, when I suddenly have every single chapter a monologue, I have taken away one of my strengths from myself, you know. But it wasn't wasted time. I worked on that version for almost a year, and it's not wasted time because it really helped me learn each of the characters' voices and make those voices more unique and distinct. But it was one of the very last drafts when I decided it would be the sister's story. And that changed everything, broke the story open, and was something that had not been offered yet in work that dealt with AIDS. Kindness of Strangers had 7 major rewrites. Blessings of the Animals had 6 giant ones, one in which the book became 2 separate books, but I'll talk about that later. So another piece of advice that I always tell people who want to write is you have to be really in love with it, because you're going to spend so much time with it. And you have to be willing to do the work. There's nothing glamorous about it, rewriting the same story 6 different times. Just last night I was teaching a class about revision. And I never really understand writers who don't like revision. Because I always feel like the first draft is the scariest part. And once it's on the page, I feel like I can somehow control it. And now I can really start to make it a real book. But a lot of writers hate the revision. They write the draft and then they want to be done. And I always feel like, well, that's when the work really begins. So you have to be willing to do the work, and that's where that leap and the net will appear can sometimes be misinterpreted. Leap and the net will appear can kind of suggest that someone's going to swoop in and rescue you, right? Someone's going to be rushing up with the net, but it never ever works that way. Leaping simply means that you jumpstart yourself, and then you figure it out. You have to weave the net yourself. You're galvanized into action so you don't shatter all your bones when you land, right, now that you've leapt. Julia Cameron, also, back to her in The Artist's Way, she says it's the difference between praying to catch the bus and praying to catch the bus, but also running like hell to make sure you get there on time, right? You have to have faith, but you have to be willing to do the work, and that makes all the difference. So I spent lots of time on that first novel. I call it the novel I learned on. Because I wrote that horrible, awful, long, indulgent draft and gave it to people to read, and they said, well, I'm not sure whose story this is. I feel like this is kind of like, here's everything you know about horses, here's everything you know about hockey, here's everything you know about AIDS. You know, it's like, but I don't really know what the story is. And so that began the journey of all the changing of the point of view, as I told you, and taking all the classes, going to conferences, meeting other writers that I could share work with and get really important feedback from. And I spent about 7 years on that novel before I felt I was ready to even think about pursuing publication. This is also really important that I was talking to this group of writers last night in the revision process. There's no point in being in a hurry to get published. The publishing world is very small and kind of incestuous. People leave one publishing house for another all the time. My former agent's assistant is now my editor's assistant, right? So I'm still dealing with the same Elizabeth, but now she has a different job. So she left agenting for editing. You never know. These people cross over, they know everyone, and it's really very important that you make that first impression with something really, really good. It needs to be very polished. It needs to be the best possible work you can do before you even think about looking for an agent. And I'm always so disheartened by writers who will come to a writing class and that's the first thing they want to know about is getting an agent. And I'm like, well, what kind of writing do you do? Well, I'm thinking about doing this or that. I'm like, well, what have you done? And it'll turn out they've not written anything, but they're already researching agents. And it's really, there's no point in doing that. You don't want to blow that first impression. You get that one chance for them to be really excited about your work, so it's got to be the best that you can do. So, after these 7 years, I finally felt like, okay, I think I'm ready. And because I had changed, you get to a point where you might just be changing the book, but you're not necessarily making it better anymore. So I was ready to, like, I don't want to change anything else until I get an opinion from somebody in the business. Well, with full-length fiction, they tell you you need to have an agent. That's not true with short stories. And so I begin this process where you have to query agents. You write these awful, horrible things called query letters, which I think are harder to write than the entire novel. In one page, you have to tell them, here's what my book is about, Here's how it's different from anything else on the market that deals with this subject. So they expect you to be a reader. They expect you to know what's already been done and what's out there. And that's another thing that always gets me steamed, is when I meet writers who don't read. I'm like, why would you ask to be a part of this industry that you don't even support? They expect you to be a reader and know this stuff. So here's what the book's about. Here's how it's different from anything else that deals with this subject. And here's why I want you to represent me. They don't want to know that you're sending it to every single agent in the guidebook to literary agents. They want to know that you want them for a particular reason, like something like, I see you represent Jodi Picoult, and she also deals with social issues. We might have a similar readership. Something like that that shows you've done this research. The research can be really tedious, but there's no magic or mystery to it. All the answers are out there, just that you take a little digging. So, over the course of a year, I queried 27 agents. You can't send the manuscript to speak for yourself. You're only allowed to send the letter. And this was before everybody was doing email, so you actually sent the letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope. Remember that? And now most people will let you send the queries through email. But so I queried 27. Only 3 of those 27 asked to see the first 50 pages, which was typical then. And now that's changing. I have friends who are querying agents now, and they're being told to send the first 20 pages, and one who was recently asked to send the first 5. So you don't get much. That story needs to begin. You can't say, oh, but there's something really great in chapter 3, and they'll never see chapter 3 if you don't hook them in those opening pages. So 3 asked to see the first 50 pages, and only 1 of those 3 asked to see the entire manuscript. Now, when you get rejected, there's a whole spectrum of rejections. There's the form letter, which is everyone's favorite, right? Where an agency may list, here are 20 reasons why we won't take a book, and all they do is check mark one, and that's all you get back, okay? Sometimes you would send the query letter and your self-addressed envelope, and they would handwrite I'm sorry, it's not our thing, on your letter, and send your letter back to you, so they didn't even use their own piece of paper. But like I said, it's a very small industry, and if anyone wrote anything personal at all, or anything encouraging, I always sent a thank you note. And maybe that's just me being the nice Midwestern girl, but lots of people I've met through the years now that I'm in the business have commented on that, of how much they liked that, and how much that matters. So our good Midwestern values count, so there. But the one who asked to see the whole manuscript was Sandy Dykstra. She represents Amy Tan, among other people. So I was thrilled. And she spent a lot of time with the novel, gave me great feedback, beautiful editorial suggestions. Now, see, an agent never makes money until you do, so she's doing all of that for free. She ultimately passed on the novel as well because she had already had a client who was an author she already represented, who had also written a novel that dealt with AIDS, and she didn't feel she could return to the same publishing houses with such similar material. Now, this was in the late 90s. That would not be a concern today, but at the time it was a legitimate concern. Well, it turns out that client was Alice Hoffman and her book At Risk. And so, you get your form letter, and then you get bumped by Alice Hoffman. So there's this huge spectrum of rejections. That was a great rejection, okay? And Sandy also gave me the name of a couple agents that she thought would be very interested in my work and said I could use her as a reference. So she's not going to do the work for me, but you can bet if I queried those agents and said, Sandy Dykstra said I should send this to you, they're going to call her and say, who's this Katrina Kittle chick? Did you really say this? So that was a huge gift. That was wonderful. So feeling kind of, buoyed and very hopeful about this, getting to use them as a referral and getting her wonderful suggestions, really valuable feedback from her, I went to the Antioch Writers Workshop in Yellow Springs, Ohio. This was my 4th year attending. It's a great conference. I can't say enough about it. It's not that far away. It took me 3 hours to get here today. The conference happens every summer in July. And every summer that I went, they had exactly what I needed. Like the first year when I was completely clueless, I took a class called Finding Your Voice, and you got to experiment with all these different forms. Then the next year when I came back and I had some stuff written, there were classes where I could read out loud and get feedback. I could meet other local writers that I could continue to meet with, not just for that week in the summer, but all the time. And then they always have a guest agent and a guest editor every summer, at least one, usually more than one. Well, that summer I was a work fellow. Since I had attended so many times, I learned that, oh, you could sign up for a fellowship and you could get free tuition in exchange for doing some work for the conference. And since I was local, they had me taking guests back and forth to the airport. So I go, and I'm thrilled, and I'm taking people to the airport every day. And you know, this thing had just happened with Sandy Dykstra. I was very excited. I was getting closer. I felt like I was getting, that was a really legitimate, great rejection, but it would lead to great things. Well, in the afternoon, you're divided into different classes. There's the fiction writers, there's the playwrights, the poets, writing for children. And on the last evening, they always have what they call participants read, and one person is selected from each genre to read to the whole conference. And I got picked from the fiction class to read what was essentially the first chapter of Traveling Light. And they had a guest editor there that day, who was only there for that day. Her name was Diana Baroni. She was from Warner Books. And I went to hear her speak before I knew that I had been picked to read. And she was fun and bubbly, but she talked about how she never looked at anything that didn't come through an agent, and that she was mostly acquiring nonfiction, which most publishing houses do. And you guys are all readers, so you may find this interesting. I found it very interesting when I found this out. You know, most people in our culture don't value reading. The percentage that does mostly reads nonfiction. The smallest percentage of readers are fiction readers. So we're a minority here. But it feels very good to be with such like-minded people. But most publishing houses make their bread and butter are cookbooks and self-help books. And they make a lot more money off nonfiction than fiction. So, you know, I listened to her give this talk, and I'm like, okay, she's not someone I'm going to approach, but I learned some stuff, that's cool. And then I got picked to read, and I was very excited to go and do my reading, so I didn't check the work fellowship board. So at that night, I read to the whole conference, and she attended. And afterwards, someone said, you better check the board, and I did, and I was stuck picking her up and taking her to the airport. And I say stuck because I had to pick her up from her bed and breakfast at 5:30 in the morning. And I'm like, oh, okay, great, well, all right, whatever. So I pick her up the next morning after these horrible, horrible thunderstorms, and she gets in the car, and her very first words are, I really like what you read last night. Is that book finished? That was her first question. I said, yeah, and do you have an agent? And I told her about Sandy Dykstra and what she, you know, the referrals, and she kept asking me questions the whole drive to the airport, and I thought she was just being polite. You're at a writer's conference, so you're going to say, well, what do you write, you know? And we got to the airport. This was way before September 11th. Remember when you could actually go in and hang out at the terminal with someone until they flew away? Her flight was delayed because of the fog from the thunderstorms. And so we had breakfast together. We're sitting there eating Cinnabons, and she keeps talking to me about the novel. And by the time she flew away, she gave me her card and invited me to send her the entire manuscript, which I did the very next day. And, you know, it took her several months to get to it, to actually read it. And she would occasionally send me emails and say, is the book still available? I'm like, yeah, it is. But I held out hope, and she finally, it was around Christmas time, called with those magic words. It's like winning a lottery. You know, Warner would like to buy this book. Do you have an agent? I'm like, I don't yet. And she goes, well, I don't think you'll have trouble finding one now. So I could go back to Sandy at that point and say, Warner would like to buy this novel. Would you represent me? And the hardest part of the agent's job is done for them. But you still need one. Because some people were like, well, why'd you even need one at all at that point? You know, because they didn't sell your book, you did. But you do need one. And the agent was able to turn it into a 2-book deal and change all kinds of things. And you really need them to help navigate how complicated the contract and the whole business is. But one of the things I love about this, you know, people love that story because that's not how it normally works. You know, the whole idea of like you need an agent first, and I actually had an editor interested first. And they always say it sounds like a fairy tale, and oh, you were so lucky. And what I love is once, about that editor, Diana, is once we were on a panel telling that story together in New York City, and somebody said, oh, Katrina, you were at the right place at the right time. And I love Diana forever because she said, well, she was at the right place at the right time with a finished manuscript. And so that made all the difference, right? It wouldn't have done me any good to drive her to the airport if I hadn't written a book and spent years polishing it. Because I'd asked her, that was her first question, remember, is that book finished? And I asked her later, what if I told you, oh, I'm about 5 chapters in, what, would you have asked anything else? And she goes, no, I would have asked you about Young's Dairy and the cornfields and the goats, you know, because she's from Manhattan. She was like, I wouldn't have asked anything else about the book. She goes, I don't have time to care about a book that's not written because most people who start to write books never finish them. So I love that. It's like the reminder, just write it, write it, write it. You can always make it better. Now, because the answer was yes, the book is finished, yeah, it became the right place at the right time. So I ended up with a 2-book deal with Warner, and after Traveling Light came Two Truths and a Lie. But when I brought them the 3rd book, Kindness to Strangers, they weren't interested. They said it was too controversial, which was really frustrating to me. Some of you I spoke to today when I arrived know the book, and you know, yes, that sounds like a scary topic, but it's not really a book about child abuse. It's like I told you, I'm interested in the story of resilience and healing. And to me, it was really the story of this family that was already broken in their own ways, reaching out to help someone else worse off than them, and only in the reaching out do they start their own healing journey, and that's what makes them whole again. But people would hear child sex abuse and be like, oh, we don't know how to sell that. So lots of sales reps and publicity, promotion, those kind of staffs and reps were saying, we don't know what to do with this book. So my agent tried other publishers, they were all rejections, and then she retired from agenting. So she started an artist colony in Santa Fe, and she was not going to agent anymore, and my publishing house was sort of done with me. You know, they were like, we'll look at anything else you write, but we don't want this book. And I really believed in kindness. I didn't want to give up on it and write them something else. I wanted to find a home for that book. So, here, you know, back to that quote about the world breaks everyone, right? I was pretty lucky, because at that point, that was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and that's really no big deal, and it turned out okay, but it was like, I had 2 books in the world, and I was essentially starting all over again. So it's a crazy business, it really, truly is. So I needed a new agent and a new publisher, but during that time, it allowed me to do a rewrite of the book. I really believed in the book, kept trying to make it better. And some people have always asked me once things went well for Kindness, and I'll explain how they did go well for that book, but they're like, weren't you mad at Warner Books? Don't you want to thumb your nose at them? I'm like, no, not at all, because Diana, that initial editor, helped me find another amazing powerhouse agent. She completely believed in the kindness of strangers. And she told me, she goes, it's not so shocking that Warner won't let me buy Kindness as it was that they ever let me buy Traveling Light. She goes, you don't fit our demographic. Their bestseller is Nicholas Sparks, and I don't write anything like him, and I'm not ever going to. Do you know what I mean? There's a place for everything, but each publishing house kind of has its target audience, and I didn't really fit with Warner. And I remember sitting in her office, and she said, I picture Kindness as like a Harper perennial. That would be perfect. And then that's exactly where it ended up, thanks to her. Because she couriered the manuscript. I mean, this isn't even a real book. The manuscript of Kindness to 3 different big wig agents. And I ended up having 2 interested in me, and I got to pick. I mean, how often does a writer get to do that? It was like amazing. And my new agent, Lisa Bankoff, who I'm still with, sold it to HarperCollins within 2 weeks. So it ended up as a Harper perennial, just like Diana said. So when they're like, are you mad at Warner? Like, not at all. Things happen as they should for a reason. I know that sounds very Pollyanna-ish, but sometimes it takes a while to see the plan. But I'm much better off at Harper. And then that new agent took me to a whole new level, and I love being with HarperCollins. When the first 2 books went out of print as Warner books, and I was all upset about that, they were like, no, let them go out of print. Here's what you do to get the rights reverted back to you. And then as soon as you have them reverted back to you, tell us, because we want them. And so Harper re-released them. So now all 4 books are under the HarperCollins roof, which is a great, great place to be as a writer. And then great things happened for that book that nobody wanted, that everyone kept rejecting, that I had to leave the publishing house because of this book. It ended up being my most successful novel so far, and it won the Great Lakes Book Award for fiction. So, you know, that's that thing too, that affirmation and validation of like, I kept writing what I believed in. I didn't, when people said it's not marketable, I'm like, that's the story I'm passionate about. And I think writers must follow those paths. You have to write what you care about. If you don't care about your story, no one else will. And if you don't care about your story, it will show. And so I feel very affirmed that I hung in there with that book.
HarperCollins was also very interested in my next book, which is what would become The Blessings of the Animals. The first draft was titled My Beautiful Disaster, and then later, for a couple years, we called it Dancing at the Church of St. Equine, which is still a title that I love more than The Blessings of the Animals, but I let that go. The social issue in that book is marriage, as I told you, and the idea came to me with these two back-to-back radio stories. For all of my books, I can tell you the exact moment that I had the thought of, like, this could be a story. I was driving from Dayton to Cincinnati on 75, and it's notoriously, there's always an accident, or things are just stalled and stopped, and it was kind of sleeting, and it was one of those days of, like, thank God for NPR, because it's keeping me from clawing my skin off as I just sat there on the highway being late to a book club. And there were two stories back to back. The first one was a woman saying how marriage as an institution in Western culture was obsolete. And I completely reacted to that. My knee-jerk reaction was, well, no, it's not. What is she talking about? And then she kept talking about how the reasons for marriage's existence, long before the church was ever involved in it, those reasons no longer exist. Women do not need marriage to own property, to have status, to have children. And her point was that marriage only benefited men in Western culture anymore, and that marriage was no longer necessary. And again, I was like, yes, it's necessary. But see, I'd taught English for so long that I was like, okay, if I was going to write a paper in my own class defending marriage, what would I use as ammunition? And I couldn't think of anything, which made me crazy. I was like, how do you defend it? Why is it necessary? You know? Then the very next story, following that one, was about the Defense of Marriage Act, where, I don't know if you remember, President Bush was attempting to change the U.S. Constitution to permanently ban same-sex marriage, that it would no longer be a state-to-state decision, that it would just be done and over with. We're still fighting that battle, by the way. But, so I'm like, that's interesting, as they're interviewing all these people who are fighting for the right, who've been with their partners for like 3 decades and can't, have marriage rights. And there are lots of rights that come with marriage. I thought, okay, here's all these people fighting to belong to this obsolete institution. How interesting is that? Why do they want in if it's obsolete, And so I thought, okay, this could be a story. But like I said, it has to be a story. So I can't just write a book where I'm examining marriage and what it means in our culture. There has to be people who can tell a story and have, characters who would populate that. And so I'm like, what makes people examine marriage? A proposal makes people talk about marriage, and so does a divorce. And in fiction, conflict is your best friend. It's the exact opposite of real life. So you want conflict. So I'm like, okay, the divorce will be better. The divorce will give me more conflict. But I couldn't let go of that proposal idea either. And so as I had this main character who was going through a divorce, I wanted to surround her with all these other couples in these very milestone places. Like her parents are about to celebrate their 50th. Her brother and his partner can't get married and are attempting to adopt a child. Her best friend, soon to be her ex-sister-in-law, just got engaged and wants her to be the maid of honor. Her daughter, who's in high school, has some complications with her own romance because of the fallout from the divorce. There's all these other couples in these places. And remember how I said you use everything? I had long wanted to write about rescue animals. And I was always really fascinated in the way that rescue animals always end up saving the people who save them. Have you seen that happen over and over again? And so I didn't know that those would be in the same story initially. So again, I just start writing and sort of examining this, figuring out who the people are, and then I kind of found how they would, those two stories could braid together. And I started to see the parallel of the shelter animals, these discarded animals that have grown inconvenient in the way humans will just get rid of them. And humans do that to each other in relationships as well. I had this thread of the emotional honesty of animals as opposed to the very complicated, sometimes treacherous honesty of humans. Now, I was married at the time I started that book. I was working on that book for 2 years, already fascinated by that subject, when my own divorce happened. It was not my choice, it was a total surprise. That was 6 years ago, so it's all fine now. I can always feel the energy slightly change when I say that. It's like everyone's like, oh no, what is she gonna say? It's all good. But then of course, that changed the book. Every divorce is as different as every marriage, but of course I understood some things differently. I'd been married for 13 years, and then suddenly I wasn't. And so the book very much changed because of that. Now, especially locally, that became a very interesting thing at book signings. Because Dayton's not that big of a town. You guys know what it's like when everybody from your community sort of knows each other. And even though it was not my story at all, there were a few things said and done that were too good not to use. Because writers use everything, and my ex knows it. And if he was always very supportive of the writing. So he knows, and I think I was very kind in the book, and he's the only one who knows what's actually real. That's the setback there, this idea of the world breaking you, was that I wasn't able to write. I couldn't read or write for about a year, where I was just kind of unraveled and out of my mind. And then when I did come back to the story, I felt like I was an entirely different person, and it was essentially like starting it all over again. They tell you to write what you know, but I think that advice can be very limiting sometimes. I think you can write what you want to know. And that's what led me in Two Truths and a Lie to help understand addiction, because I had friends going through that. And in The Blessings of the Animals, it became, again, about wanting to understand what makes a really good marriage that lasts. Because you meet people, not every marriage that lasts is a good one, right? But the really good ones, how do they pull that off? And so that became the driving force. And that's why Cammie has a daughter, is because it made more sense for her to want to figure that out for the daughter than just for herself. So, because with my own story, there wasn't any satisfying closure, but with a novel, there better be, right? So it's not a true story. That's the beauty of fiction, that you try to make it a better story than real life sometimes offers you. Now, Blessings was in the works when I underwent I was about to go through a pretty big rewrite when I hit another leaping point. So back to that opening quote. This was not a setback at all, but much more of a crossroads, where kindness had done well enough that it had allowed me to take the chance, take the leap, if you will, to leave full-time teaching, which I had been doing through the writing of all of these novels, and just be a writer. Especially since, we didn't have kids, I didn't own a home, a cat that I'd had for 15 years had just passed away, so it was like no one was dependent on me. If I was going to take a big chance, this was the perfect time. And I walked away from a salary and benefits right when the economy tanked, and every single headline became about how hard it was to find jobs. But I think the thing is, there are always reasons not to risk, and I think it's much more important to look for the reasons to do something. What are you gonna get from this? And what I knew I would get was that I would have no regrets. I wanted to see how long I could ride this. How long could I make this last? Because this is a crazy and unreliable way to make money. When people want to do this to make money, I always laugh. I'm like, are you nuts? There's a million other things to do besides write. But, so I walked away. The worst case scenario, I was teaching at a private school then, and a lot of the kids at this private school, the Miami Valley School, were so afraid to take risks unless they knew they could be perfect at something. So my leaving, I thought, was really important. It was important to me for them to understand exactly why I was doing this. And I said, failure was possible, and that was okay. Failure is not the end of the world. The worst case scenario was my money would run out and I would have to do something else. That's totally survivable. What's the big deal? But I would know, and for so far, 3 years, I've been, just writing. So life is so much more interesting when you stop worrying about how things look to other people. So I left, but I decided to up the stakes. I wasn't just going to leave teaching, but I was going to embark on this experiment that I called my year as a gypsy. I had been hugely influenced by Eat, Pray, Love, but I could not afford to do what she did, and my publisher was not going to pay me to write that book because that was already written. So I did my own cheap, frugal version of it, where I just put the word out to various friends that I was looking for empty homes to write in. I was not on vacation, but I wanted for a year to leave the Midwest. Obviously, I've chosen to return. I have nothing against the Midwest, but that's another quote I love, is that each time you experience the new, you are open to inspiration, and you're more receptive to inspiration. And so I'm like, this is the perfect time to just get out of my comfort zone, to live other places, and long enough to live there and not just be a tourist. And so I did, and I ended up, my 2 longest stays were 4 months in this teeny weeny little town in Connecticut, in the Litchfield Hills. It was called Warren. It was my agent's weekend home. I was there for 4 months. She only came up twice. But this was like the last house on a dead-end country road. You could hear coyotes at night. There was a bear in my yard on 3 different occasions. once there was a bear between me and my car, and I was like, what do I do? And what I did was I took the smoke alarm off the wall and went outside on the porch and pressed it, and he ran away. So, because I'm like, I need to go, and I'm not going to go mess with this bear. But it was like, that's where I finished Blessings. And, I didn't know anyone, and so each place, when I would go to one of these places, I would volunteer somewhere, and that was the way to make a community and meet people. And in Connecticut, I worked for this horse rescue place. Those scenes were already written in Blessings, but it just kind of fed that, and I met some amazing people that I'm still friends with. But it was kind of like being in a monastery. We couldn't get cell or internet reception at the house, and it wasn't just like I didn't pay for it. You couldn't get it there. And so it was very isolated. I worked like crazy all day, but I was only 20 minutes from a train station that would take me to Grand Central in under 2 hours. So almost every weekend I went to New York City to get human contact and talk about being out of your comfort zone. And it was one of those weekends that I met up with a former student from when I first started teaching high school, who was now an attorney about to go on sabbatical and desperate for someone to care for her very elderly dog who was blind and had epilepsy. That was Stella. So I ended up living for 4 months in Brooklyn in Park Slope in a loft that I could never afford in my wildest dreams. And I stayed there for free because I was taking care of Stella. So, I had this amazing year of just totally out of my comfort zone, experiencing amazing things. And in Brooklyn, I volunteered for Housing Works, this great AIDS service organization in Manhattan, and would work in their bookstore. And I have friends there, someone's coming to stay with me for a week that I met during that Brooklyn stay. So it's just that thing about writers need experiences. That goes back to that quote about having the artful life. So in 365 days, I lived in 18 different homes. In Brooklyn, I wrote the draft of my first young adult novel, and that it's actually a tween novel, more for like 6th and 7th graders. It's called Reasons to Be Happy. It was rejected by 11 publishers over the course of a year, and now is coming out in October with Source Books. The only reason Harper Teen passed on it, because they wanted to keep me, was because right now they're only selling stuff that deals with paranormal. I was like, oh, okay. But they're very interested in another young adult book that I'm working on right now. So, again, just because you're in it doesn't mean the struggles are ever over. It's never a done deal. And I continue to work on the next young adult book, even when that first one was getting rejected and we had no idea if it would ever sell. And by now you know how I feel about risk. But I think it was very important to people thought that was crazy. Why are you writing another one? You haven't sold the first. But I was like, because that's the story I care about. That's what I'm passionate about. And I think we have to hang on to that. So failure is always possible. The outcome to any of our endeavors is always in doubt, but that makes taking the risks and then succeeding all the more satisfying. So the nets are out there. I think whether you want to write or whether it's something else entirely, the secret to leaping is knowing that the nets are already in your own hands. So thank you very much for letting me ramble today, and I wish you all best wishes with your own leaping. Thank you very much.